They fired once. We fired 8 times. The jungle reeked of rot and sweat. Even before the shooting began, the air felt electric with tension, thick with fear. Guadalcanal wasn't just another Pacific island. It was shrouded in palms, and beyond the tree line, the Japanese waited, silent, unseen, watching. Corporal Tech Kellahan adjusted his helmet and crouched by a snarl of undergrowth, his M1 Garand across his knees. It was early August, 1942. The 1st Marine Division had landed 3 days ago, but this was the first time Tech truly felt the enemy was close, really close. His squad, 9 men with faces shaped by salt, sand, and sleepless nights, had been ordered to dig in near the Tenaroo River, which the men had started calling Alligator Creek. The captain warned they might counterattack tonight, said they were angry, said they'd come in waves. Tech heard Lance Corporal Frankie Delgado whispering the Lord's Prayer. Private Jenkins, just 18, kept tapping his M1's metal stock like a nervous habit. Sergeant Walter Grizz McKenna, grizzled and stone-faced, had briefed them earlier. They fire once, we fire 8 times. He raised his Garand like a relic, reminding them it was their best friend. 8 rounds of American steel. Semi-automatic, no bolt, no pause, pull the trigger, and it speaks again and again. Tech thought of the old Springfield still in use by some units, and how veterans of the last war still carried them. But this M1 Garand? This was modern war. It gave every man the firepower of a light machine gun. Midnight crept in under thick clouds. Insects chirped like clocks. Then from the dark came a scream, a battle cry in guttural Japanese, followed by mortar shells pounding into the earth, fire and soil bursting into the air. Tech pressed himself into the mud, heart pounding. Someone to his left yelled, "Incoming!" But it was lost in the thunder. Bullets zipped through the air. The enemy was advancing in chaos. Grizz barked for them to hold the line. Tech peeked over the log he used for cover as muzzle flashes lit the tree line. Japanese infantry surged forward in waves, bayonets gleaming. Then the Garands answered. Ping, ping, ping. The clips ejected as each Marine fired his 8 rounds in rhythm. The jungle roared. Tech stood firm and fired. Once, twice, 3 times. Each shot kicked into his shoulder like a punch. But they hit. Japanese soldiers fell mid-charge, their momentum shattered. That phrase echoed in his head. They fired once. We fired 8 times. He emptied his clip, heard the sweet ping, slapped in another, and kept firing. Frankie laughed beside him, half hysteria, half adrenaline. Jenkins screamed when a round grazed him, but kept shooting. 8 more rounds, 8 more chances to survive. The Japanese formations fell apart. They weren't used to this volume of fire. Their rifles, the bolt-action Arisaka Type 38, couldn't keep up. Fire. Work the bolt. Fire again. If they lived that long. Tech saw hesitation in their movements. Some tried to duck, to retreat, to find cover that didn't exist. The Garands barked, steady and relentless. A Japanese officer charged, sword raised, but Grizz dropped him with 2 rounds. They think this is 1905, he muttered. We've got Garands. By 3 a.m. the assault was broken. The sand and brush were littered with bodies. Smoke coiled into the sky. Silence returned. Tech collapsed behind his log, drenched in sweat and grime, hands shaking. The Garand smoked gently. He cradled it like something alive. Around him, the others were quiet. Some wounded, all exhausted, but alive. Because they had stood their ground. Because they had the M1 Garand. Grizz moved down the line, checking his men. When he reached Tech, he gave a rare nod. Tech looked up and said, "They didn't know what hit them." Grizz smirked. "They do now." As the sun rose over Alligator Creek, casting a blood-orange hue across the battlefield, the squad gathered what strength they had left. They cleaned rifles, replaced clips, treated the wounded. The war wasn't over, but they had proven something that night. The M1 Garand wasn't just a rifle. It was a force multiplier. It turned 9 men into a wall of steel. Somewhere out there, surviving Japanese soldiers whispered about the thunder that came from the American line. "They fired once," Tech murmured, "but we fired 8 times." The sun climbed over wreckage and ash. Steam curled off the ground. Birds chirped in eerie contrast to the silence. Tech sat with his back to a tree stump, Garand in his arms. It had saved him. Saved all of them. The wood was nicked and scorched, but still solid. He wiped down the barrel, inspecting the gas system that made the rifle special. No bolt to pull. No bolt to fumble. Just trigger. Fire. Trigger again. 8 rounds of justice. The others moved like ghosts. Some bandaged wounds. Some cleaned gear. Jenkins sat cross-legged, muttering, his hands trembling as he fed a clip into his rifle. Tech asked if he was okay. Jenkins blinked. They just kept coming, even when they were hit. Tech nodded. "Yeah, they don't quit easy." Grizz appeared, sleeves rolled, dirt and blood streaked down his arms. He called the squad together. 9 now, down from 11. Hall had taken a bayonet. Burns had caught shrapnel. They buried both before dawn. Helmets marked their graves. Grizz said intel reported the Japanese were pulling back, but they'd come again. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. He looked each Marine in the eye. "We held this ground because we had discipline and firepower. That Garand in your hands? Trust it more than your mother. They still carry bolt actions. That's seconds lost. Seconds you don't get back. Us? We drown them in lead. That's how we survive." The men didn't nod with pride, just understanding. Tech looked at his rifle. Hall's blood still stained the trigger guard. He left it. By afternoon, they were back on patrol, pushing east toward the ridge over the Ilu River. The Japanese were regrouping. Grizz didn't like it, but orders were orders. The column moved through razor grass and tangled roots. The heat soaked their uniforms. Mosquitoes swarmed in thick clouds. Frankie whispered that it smelled like death. Tech muttered, "That's because it is." 2 miles in, Jenkins froze and raised a fist. Silence. 6 Japanese soldiers appeared by the riverbank, unaware they were being watched. Ragged, worn, one had a sword. Grizz signaled a split maneuver. Tech and Jenkins moved right. Frankie and Big Red flanked left. When they were in position, Tech fired. The first shot hit center mass. Jenkins dropped another. 4 Garands roared. The Japanese scattered. One tried returning fire, but his shot was wild. Tech kept firing. 4, 5, 6. Smooth recoil. Fast aim. The Garand made them all feel like they carried automatics. Frankie's round ended it. 6 enemies. 6 kills. Tech reloaded, moved to check the bodies. Steam rose off the river. Grizz joined them, chewing tobacco. That's how it's done. Tech picked up an Arisaka, 1 shot at a time. He looked at Jenkins. "You see the difference now?" Jenkins stared at his Garand and nodded. "They fired once. We fired 8 times. The patrol moved deeper into the trees. Hardened, rifles worn, trusted. They reached the ridge as the sun dipped low. Foxholes were dug, tripwires set. Grizz handed out extra bandoliers. Another attack was coming. No question. Just when? That night, Tech settled into his hole, Garand across his chest, eyes on the stars. He thought of Hall, of the sword-wielding officer, of the terrified face of the rifleman Jenkins dropped. He didn't feel joy or pride, just readiness. The enemy would come again, with honor and desperation. But Tech and his squad would come with M1 Garands, and that meant they came with thunder. Darkness thickened. The air felt like syrup, clinging to skin. Crickets chirped. Branches snapped in the dark. Tech sat in his foxhole above the Ilu River, his Garand across his knees. Jenkins twitched in his sleep, chased by ghosts. Frankie leaned against a tree, chewing gum like it was the last thing keeping him sane. Tech felt it in his gut. They were coming tonight. Intel said it was the HE detachment, elite troops from China. They expected to overrun Marines who'd spent weeks digging holes and eating cold beans. They didn't know what waited for them. They didn't know about the Garand. Its rhythm, squeeze, bang, and the eighth round's ping, like a bell of judgment. The Marines called it freedom's sound. The Japanese didn't laugh. Tech checked his bandolier. 5 full clips, 40 rounds. It would have to be enough. At 0200 hours, the ridge exploded in light. Flares lit up the sky like ghostly fireworks, casting shadows across the tree trunks and lighting up the leaves in a pale, hellish glow. Mortar rounds hit just behind the Marine lines, sending dirt and shrapnel skyward. One shell landed too close. Tech felt the shock wave before he heard the boom. Jenkins jolted awake, screaming. Someone screamed at the line. From the tree line below, Japanese soldiers emerged like wraiths, screaming, bayonets fixed, charging uphill with terrifying discipline. Many wore no shirts. Some had painted faces. It was like something out of a nightmare. Grizz's voice cut through the chaos like a chainsaw. Tech didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. The Garand kicked. The first shot slammed into a charging soldier's chest. Tech shifted his aim and fired again. Another man crumpled face down in the mud. He didn't count his shots this time. He felt them. Then the clip pinged. He slapped in a new one and kept going. All down the line, the M1s sang in unison. It was a wall of fire, a curtain of steel. The Japanese never expected it. They were used to bolt-action rifles, to a rhythm, a pause, a reload. But the Garands didn't pause. Tech saw one Japanese machine gunner try to set up an old Nambu, but Frankie nailed him with 3 fast shots before he even got the tripod down. Jenkins, shaky and pale, emptied his clip into a cluster of shadows and grinned with something close to disbelief. He shouted they were falling back. Tech growled that they were regrouping. Sure enough, a second wave surged from the trees. This one larger, faster, louder. One soldier had a katana held over his head. Another blew a shrill whistle. Tech felt no fear, only fury. He leaned over his foxhole and fired again. 6 rounds, 2 kills. Ping! He ducked to reload just as a grenade landed a few feet away. Without thinking, he grabbed Jenkins and pulled him down. The explosion ripped open the earth, sending splinters of wood and mud into the air. When Tech looked up, half the ridge was on fire, and still the Garands barked. Grizz appeared from the smoke, his helmet knocked sideways, blood dripping from his cheek. He fired as he moved, his Garand barking like a wild dog. He roared that they wouldn't take the ridge. Tech saw the Japanese start to hesitate. They weren't used to this. Americans firing like machine gunners, no breaks, no mercy. One officer tried to rally them, but a bullet took him in the throat. He crumpled silently. Then Tech heard the click of an empty chamber. He reached for his last clip. Only one left. He gritted his teeth and rammed it home. He muttered for one more time. The final charge came just before dawn. A wall of screaming men, some carrying grenades, others swinging swords, charging with suicidal resolve. But they met a wall of lead. Tech didn't fire carefully now. He just shot. Ping. Reload. Bang. Ping. Jenkins was out of ammo, swinging his entrenching tool like a club. Frankie's rifle jammed for the first time all night, but he cleared it with a slap and kept firing. Grizz stood on the rise of the hill, exposed, firing from the hip. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was silent, focused. A soldier born for this moment. Then it was over. The final enemy broke and ran, disappearing into the jungle like smoke in the wind. Some lay wounded, moaning. Others didn't move at all. Tech collapsed into the mud, his Garand resting across his chest like a weight he didn't want to lose. The ridge had held. Around him, the Marines sat in stunned silence. No cheers, no celebration, just heavy breathing and the metallic scent of blood. Grizz staggered over, his uniform blackened by fire and grime. Jenkins whispered that they did it. Grizz nodded, saying the Garands did most of the talking. Tech managed a tired smile. He looked down at the rifle in his hands. 8 rounds, gas-operated, American steel. It had spoken louder than anyone thought possible. Dawn brought no peace. The battlefield looked like something out of hell. Bodies tangled in the roots, steam rising from the soil, broken bayonets stuck in tree trunks, rifles discarded like forgotten tools. The sun filtered through the jungle canopy in slivers, casting long shadows that mocked the silence. Tech sat with his back against a blown-out banyan tree, the barrel of his Garand still warm even hours after the last shot. They had survived the night, but not without cost. Simmons had taken a grenade to the chest. Big Red had bled out from a bayonet wound. Jenkins had a deep shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Doc said he'd live, but he'd be on a hospital ship before sundown. Grizz paced the perimeter like a man possessed, checking foxholes, making sure weapons were loaded, ammo collected. He hadn't slept. None of them had. Tech stared at the Garand in his lap. He remembered boot camp, the first time the DI shoved the rifle into his hands and barked that it wasn't just a weapon, it was his lifeline. Now he understood. The Garand didn't jam, didn't fumble, didn't complain. It delivered. He pulled a rag from his pack and began wiping it down, careful with each stroke. He'd fired more than 80 rounds, and it had never failed him. Frankie walked over, grim-faced, eyes red. He squatted beside Tech and held up his Garand, saying the bolt was sticky. Tech took it gently, examined the stock, and told him the op rod was bent, but still usable. Frankie sighed and said maybe they'd swap it back at the depot, if they ever got back. The jungle was thick with tension, as if the trees themselves were waiting for the next wave. Frankie said he never thought a rifle could make this much difference. Tech nodded. The Garand changed the rules. The Orisaka was strong, accurate, but slow. The Garand gave them momentum. Seconds mattered. Patton had called it the best battle implement ever devised. Tech thought he was right. Grizz appeared, crouched, and dropped a bandolier between them. Battalion wanted them pushing south by 1300. Frankie blinked. They were advancing. Grizz said they had momentum. They had just broken one of the best banzai charges since Wake. Command wanted to hit the enemy before they regrouped. Tech and Frankie exchanged a look. No argument. Grizz pointed at Tech's rifle and told him to keep it close and let it do its job. Tech nodded. Always. By noon, the squad was moving again. 7 men now. Jenkins had been evacuated. Simmons and Big Red were gone. The jungle felt tighter. The air heavier with what had been survived and what was still to come. They hiked in silence. The Garands rode comfortably in their hands, no longer tools but extensions of will. When they stopped for water, Grizz handed out extra clips. Every man now carried 80 rounds. The brass wasn't taking chances. At 1500 hours, They reached a clearing where remnants of a Japanese mortar position smoldered. Bodies were burned, twisted. Tech stepped over a discarded Arisaka and shook his head. Frankie kicked the bolt-action rifle aside. Then shots cracked from the tree line. Snap! Snap! Grizz shouted for cover. The squad hit the dirt. Tech rolled behind a log, raised his Garand, and scanned. He spotted flashes of khaki. He whispered that he was flanking left and moved low through the brush. Frankie followed. The ambush was sloppy. Maybe the enemy was exhausted, maybe broken. Tech crept up until he had a clear line of sight on a machine gun nest. Bang! One dropped. Bang! Another. Bang! The last one saw him just before death. Ping! Clack! The jungle went quiet. When they regrouped, Grizz gave Tech a long look. He said the Japanese weren't the same soldiers anymore. Tech said neither were they. That night, they bivouacked in the ruins of a coconut plantation. Rain came heavy, masking the night. Tech lay back on his poncho, staring at the canopy. The Garand rested on his chest. He didn't think about the war. Not tonight. He thought about the rifle, about how it had kept him alive, about Jenkins probably talking about the ping. He thought about the next fight. There would always be another fight. And as long as he had that rifle in his hands, he'd be ready. Dawn broke red. Mist hung low and thick across the jungle floor. The air was heavy with rot and smoke and something worse. Tech stood at the edge of the plantation field, Garand slung across his chest. The squad was down to 6. Their faces had changed. No more jokes, only hollow eyes. It wasn't fear anymore, it was focus. Grizz led the way, every step calculated, every glance a scan. They called it the Island of Death now. By mid-morning, they entered contested ground. A week ago, it belonged to the Japanese. Now it was no man's land. Bodies lay where they fell, some stripped, some decomposed. Tech found a boot with a foot in it and looked away. Frankie gagged. Grizz told him to get used to it, or end up like them. The sun climbed high. The heat turned the ground to mud. Then a sniper shot rang out. Private Lasco was hit. No gasp, just fell. Tech spotted movement in the canopy, aimed, and fired. Bang! A body fell. Grizz said Lasco didn't suffer. No one replied. They moved slower now. Hours later they reached a dry creek bed. Grizz raised a fist. Voices. Japanese. Tech belly-crawled to the edge. Across the creek were enemy soldiers, lean and wounded but alive. Grizz whispered for a call. Tech said fast and hard. The signal went back. He loaded a fresh clip. 8 rounds. He aimed. Bang. The man dropped. Shouting. Garands roared. Bang. Ping. Reload. Fire again. The Japanese scrambled. Tech dropped one, then another. Frankie and O'Hara flanked left, spraying fire. It lasted less than 2 minutes. 11 Japanese lay dead. They crossed the creek, checked for life. One soldier moaned. Grizz walked up and shot him. No time for prisoners. Tech told the others to grab ammo and water. Frankie picked up an Arisaka and said it was a relic. Tech nodded. The Garand was the future. Grizz smirked. The future was killing a lot of people. They set up camp nearby, rifles across their laps. Tech cleaned his rifle. Frankie asked if he ever thought about how many lives it had taken. Tech said it wasn't about that. It was about how many were still here to count. The Garand wasn't just a rifle. It was their voice, their power, their shield. The jungle didn't sleep. Even at night, it breathed heavy like a living thing. Every man curled around his rifle like it was a child in need of protection. Tech stared up, sweat pouring, rifle across his chest. He hadn't slept in days. A branch snapped. Everyone woke at once, rifles raised. Then whispers, Japanese voices. Grizz signaled, "Don't fire yet. They were scouts. One passed so close, Frankie could have grabbed his boot." The scout paused, turned. Then Tech fired. The scout went down. The others ran. Frankie and O'Hara opened up. Ping. Tech reloaded. More screams. Then silence. Grizz said they'd know now. Tech muttered to let them come. At first light, they moved again toward the knife edge. One trail in, one out. If the Japanese held it, the Americans were bottled up. If they took it, they owned the view. Tech didn't like it. Too many ways to die. By midday, the heat was unbearable. The ambush hit. Machine gun fire cut down O'Hara. Tech hit the ground, rolled, and fired back. Grizz shouted orders. The Japanese were dug in with bunkers and mortars. Frankie was bleeding, but firing. Tech told Grizz they had to flank. Grizz agreed. Tech crawled through mud, vines, and rock, climbed. A Japanese soldier charged. Tech ducked, slammed into him, rolled, and shot. At the top, he found the trench. Machine gun crew. Bang, bang. Ping, reload. Mortar crew. Bang, bang. Last man ran. Bang. Silence. Grizz and the others came up. Frankie limped. Grizz asked if Tech did it. Tech said the Garand did. They built defenses, claimed the ridge. From the top, the jungle stretched endless. But they had the high ground. As the sun dipped, they sat in a half circle. Frankie said if they'd had Springfields, they'd all be dead. Grizz agreed. Tech said nothing. He ran a cloth over his rifle. It had eaten dust, mud, blood, and never failed. Tech was already sighting down his Garand. The first silhouettes emerged from the foliage like shadows cast by fire, helmets low, bayonets fixed, rifles high. They screamed as they came, a chilling cry that echoed up the slope. Tech fired. The first wave fell before they reached halfway. But more poured from the jungle, dozens of them shouting, firing wildly, pushing forward like a tide that refused to recede. They wanted the ridge. They wanted it badly. Tech crouched behind a log, working the Garand like it was part of his own heartbeat. He could feel the wood heat up, smell the powder hanging in the air like smoke from hell's chimney. Frankie, even with his wounded leg, was beside him, yelling hoarse curses as he picked off shapes in the dusk. Someone shouted from the left flank. Tech turned just as 3 Japanese soldiers appeared from a side trail. Too close. He dropped one with a single round. The second dove behind a tree. The third leaped at him. Tech twisted, jammed the butt of the rifle into the man's face, and fired once from the hip. The recoil kicked like a mule, but the man flew backward, his scream lost in the thunder of battle. More were coming. Grizz tossed Tech another bandolier. Tech kept feeding that rifle. They were surrounded now, the ridge a boiling cauldron of fire and fear. Machine guns clattered, rifles cracked, grenades burst like metal fruit. A Japanese NCO climbed over the logs and lunged toward Frankie, only to be dropped mid-stride by a shot to the chest. Tech didn't even remember pulling the trigger. The Garand worked like fury incarnate. He lost count of how many he killed. The sounds changed. The screams turned from fierce to desperate. Tech heard it, their momentum breaking. The Japanese had poured everything into the charge, and it wasn't enough because every time they fired once, Tech and his Marines fired 8. By the time the firing stopped, the jungle was thick with smoke and silence. Bodies lay draped over logs, tangled in vines, and sprawled down the trail like broken puppets. Blood soaked the soil. Shell casings littered the ground like brass rain. Tech's hands were shaking. He looked down and saw that his Garand was covered in blood, his own and others. The stock had a fresh crack. The sling was gone, but the barrel still smoked, and the action still cycled. He knelt in the dirt, breathing hard, and kissed the rifle stock like a priest blessing a relic. Frankie slumped beside him and said that had to be it. Grizz stood near the edge of the ridge, scanning through his binoculars. He confirmed the enemy was pulling back. They had held it. The knife edge was theirs. Nobody cheered. Nobody had the strength. Tech sat back against the dirt wall and looked up at the stars. Fewer now, hidden behind smoke and haze. He thought about Simmons, Big Red, Lasco, O'Hara, Jenkins, and he thought about the rifle. The Garand wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of speed, strength, and American ingenuity against the slow bolt-action rifles of the enemy. It had proven itself again and again. They fired once, we fired 8. That was survival. That was dominance. That was the future. As the sky grew darker and the jungle began to quiet, Grizz walked over and sat next to Tech. He nodded at the Garand and said that rifle had saved them. Tech agreed. It did more than that. It won the ridge. They sat there in silence, 2 men and a rifle, staring down the path they had climbed just hours earlier, now littered with the fallen. The jungle might never remember their names, but the ridge would. The days after the battle passed slowly, quiet and full of ghosts. The knife edge ridge held firm. The Japanese didn't try again. They had thrown everything they had into that last charge, and the Garands had answered with fury. What the bayonet couldn't reach, the 8-round clips did. Grizz's squad, what was left of it, spent their time fortifying the position with sandbags, tripwires, and listening posts down the trail. Tech found himself on perimeter duty often, sitting motionless beneath the jungle canopy, listening for footsteps that never came. He never let the Garand leave his side. Frankie's leg was getting worse. The wound had turned red and swollen. No antibiotics, just whiskey, rags, and willpower. He never complained, but Tech saw the fever in his eyes. When Tech offered evacuation, Frankie refused. Evac was for the dying. He wasn't there yet. Tech warned him he would be if the leg turned black. Frankie smirked and said he'd shoot it off and keep fighting. That wasn't a joke. That was Guadalcanal. The ridge had given them high ground but turned them into targets. Japanese snipers harassed them day and night. Mortar fire rained down every few hours. Twice Tech saw recon planes circling overhead. He felt the next battle coiling in the trees like a snake. But something had changed. The Japanese weren't charging as confidently anymore. Their patrols stayed further back. When the Marines opened fire, the enemy ran faster. Word spread that Japanese prisoners had started calling the Garand the Devil Rifle. It fires too fast, they said. It doesn't stop. Tech liked being feared. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied. But the Garand had evened the odds. In the thick jungle, rate of fire wasn't a luxury. It was everything. Every time a Marine popped out of cover with a Garand, it sounded like 10 rifles going off at once. The enemy didn't stand a chance. They didn't fire once. They fired 8. Tech saw it in the enemy's eyes, those moments before the bullets hit. The Japanese were brave and disciplined, but they hadn't been prepared for the sound, the shock, the speed. One burst of Garand fire could stop a charge cold, and that's exactly what it had done. On the knife edge. One night, Grizz gathered the squad, now just 5, and lit a tiny lamp beneath a poncho. They got word that the division was pushing forward. They were moving out in 72 hours. Deeper inland, more ridges, more trails. The enemy was pulling back toward the mountains, digging in. Nobody responded. Tech looked around at the lean, filthy, hollow-eyed faces. They'd lost so many, and there would be more. But they nodded. They weren't going to stop. Grizz confirmed it. They'd keep going until the last enemy was gone from the island. Tech ran a hand over the Garand's receiver. Then this rifle wouldn't get a break either. Grizz smiled. The next morning, Tech found himself standing at the edge of the ridge. The jungle stretched out below, mist curling from the treetops. He thought of Simmons, Jenkins, Big Red. He pulled out Lasco's dog tag and buried it beneath a stone at the crest. He pressed the Garand into the soil like a monument. "This place remembers," he said. Later they packed up, cleaned weapons, and rechecked ammo. Tech loaded a fresh clip into his rifle. The metallic ping echoed softly as the empty one snapped free. He looked back one last time at the knife edge, then followed Grizz and the others down the trail, into the war that was far from over. The final push came 2 weeks later, an assault on a fortified Japanese stronghold near Mount Austin. Dense jungle, steep terrain, and an enemy that refused to die. Tech understood it. This was the final wall between the Marines and control of the island. They moved in at dawn. The jungle was thicker here. Every vine looked like a noose. Every tree a sniper's perch. But the squad pushed forward, silent, rifles ready. Tech's Garand felt heavier, not from weight, but from memory. Every scratch had a name. The trail narrowed. Machine gun fire burst from a hidden pillbox. Grizz hit the ground hard, dragging Frankie down with him. They returned fire. The enemy ducked. Tech didn't hesitate. He charged, grenade in one hand, Garand in the other. He reached the pillbox and tossed the grenade. The explosion silenced it. He climbed higher. Behind him, the squad followed. Grizz took a bullet in the shoulder. Frankie limped but kept firing. The Japanese used the terrain well. Their Arisaka rifles cracked, but the Garands drowned them out. Tech lost count of reloads. The ping of ejected clips became a song of vengeance. At the summit, he found a Japanese officer standing tall, sword in one hand, pistol in the other. The officer fired and missed. Tech didn't. The man fell. Tech stepped into the trench. No more movement. Just silence. Grizz limped up behind him. That was it. The last defenders of the stronghold had fallen. Guadalcanal was theirs. Tech sat on a rock, the Garand across his lap. Scarred, dirty, worn, but still strong. He thought about everything it had seen. The Americans were brave, but the Garand gave them the edge. It wasn't just a rifle. It was a revolution. Grizz dropped beside him, asked if Tech would hang the rifle over his mantle. Tech said no. If he brought it home, it would stay close. Frankie limped up, leaning on his Garand. They sat there in the dirt, the last few of the squad, watching the sunrise. Below, friend and foe lay quiet. The price had been paid. The land was theirs. Tech stood, slung the Garand over his shoulder, and looked back one last time at the mountain, the jungle, the war. Then he turned and walked into the new day. Let me know if you'd like this formatted for print or adapted for another use.